Chapter 7. Spring was come when Simon Anderson journeyed north to Toten to fetch his wife and his little son and take them home to Formoe. Then he stayed there a while to see a little to his own affairs. Kristin would not leave Oslo, and she dared not yield to her hungry, burning longing for her 3 sons who were up there in the dale. That she might still hold out and endure the life she was now living from day to day, she must not think on her children. She held out. She seemed calm and brave. She spoke with strangers and listened to strangers, and bore with their counsels and comfort. But to do this, she must hold fast to the thought of Erland alone. In the stray moments when she failed to hold her thoughts in the grasp of her will, pictures and thoughts flashed through her mind. Ivar stood in the woodshed at Formoe with Simon, watching his uncle intently as he searched out a piece of wood to helve the boy's hatchet, bending and testing the sticks with his hands. Gaut's fair boyish face set manfully as, bending forward, he struggled against the snowstorm that grey winter day in the mountains. His ski slipped back. He sank backwards some way down the slope and landed deep in a snowdrift. And for a moment his manful mien was all but gone, and he was an overwearied, helpless child. Her thoughts would turn to the 2 little ones. It was like Munin could both walk and talk a little now. Was he as lovely as the others had been at that age? Lavrans had perhaps forgotten her. And the 2 big ones out in the cloister at Tautra, Nakvi, her firstborn. How much did the 2 big ones understand, and what were their thoughts? How did Nakvi, child as he was, endure the thought that nothing in life now was like to be for him as she and he himself and all men had thought it would be? Sira Eilif had sent her a letter, and she had told Erland what was written in it of their sons. Else they never spoke of their children. They didn't speak any more of the past or of the future. Kristin brought him a piece of clothing or a dish of food. He asked her how things had gone with her since he saw her last. They sat hand in hand on his bed. Then sometimes it might chance that they were left alone a moment in the small, cold, dirty, stinking room, and they clung together with dumb, burning caresses, hearing, without really hearing, Kristin's woman laughing with the watchman outside on the stair. Time enough when he had either been taken from her or given back to her to face the thought of their troop of children and the change in their lot, of all else in her life except this man beside her. She could not bear to lose an hour of the time that was left to them together, and she dared not think of the meeting again with the 4 children she had left in the north. She was so fain to assent when Simon Anderson proffered to go alone to Trondheim and, along with Jarni Valdsen, watch over her interest in the settlement of the forfeited estates. Much richer King Magnus was not like to be for Erland's possessions. The man was more heavily in debt than he himself had had any knowledge of, and he had raised moneys that had been sent off to Denmark and Scotland and England. Erland shrugged his shoulders and said with a half-smile that he looked not now to reap any return from them. Thus Erland's case stood much as before when Simon came back to Oslo about Holy Cross Day in the autumn. But he was dismayed to see how worn out they looked, both Kristin and his brother-in-law, and he felt a strange sinking qualm at his heart when they both had yet enough self-mastery to thank him for coming hither at this time of year, when he could least well be spared from his estates at home. But now all folks' faces were set towards Tunsberg, where King Magnus was come to await his bride. A little on in the month, Simon managed to hire passage in a ship bound thither, with some merchants who were to sail in 8 days' time. Then, one morning, a strange serving man came to pray Simon Anderson to be at pains of coming at once to St. Halvard's church. Olaf Koning waited for him there. The under-treasurer was vehemently stirred. He was holding charge at the castle, whilst the treasurer was at Tunsberg. And the evening before there had come a company of gentlemen who showed him a letter under King Magnus's seal, signifying that they were to enquire into Erland Nikolausson's case, and he had had the prisoner brought into them. 3 of them were foreigners, Frenchmen doubtless. Olaf had not understood their speech, but the chaplain had spoken with them in Latin this morning, and 'tis said they are kinsmen of the lady who is to be our queen, a fair beginning. They had put Erland to the question by torture. They had with them a kind of ladder, and some fellows who were used to work such things. Today he had refused to bring Erland out of his chamber, and had set a strong watch. For so much he was ready to answer, for these were lawless doings, such as never were heard tell of in Norway before. Simon borrowed a horse from one of the priests of the church, and rode with Olaf straight away out to Akersness. Olaf Koning looked a little fearfully at the other's grimly set face, over which stormy waves of red were beating. Now and again Simon made a wild, violent movement, as if knowing not what he did, and the strange horse leapt aside, reared, and balked under his rider. "One can see on you, Simon, that you are very angry," said Olaf Koning. Simon scarce knew himself what was uppermost in his mind. He was so stirred to the depths that at times he felt qualms of sickness. The blind and wild feeling that struggled in him and goaded him to utmost fury was a kind of shame. A helpless man without weapon or defence, forced to suffer strangers' fists in his clothes, strangers manhandling his body. It was like hearing of the outraging of women. He grew dizzy with thirst for revenge, with longing to see blood shed for it. No, such things had never been the use and wont of this land. Would they accustom Norwegian nobles to suffer such things? That would never be. He was sick for horror of what he was about to see. Fear of the shame he must bring on another man by seeing him in such a pass overpowered him above all other feelings, when Olaf Koning opened to him the door of Erland's cell. Erland lay on the floor, stretched out aslant from one corner of the room to the other. He was so tall that only thus could he find room to stretch out at full length. Some straw and clothes had been laid under him on the thick layer of filth that covered the floor, and his body was covered over with his dark blue fur-lined cloak right up to the chin, so that the soft grey-brown marten fur mingled with the curly tufted black beard Erland had grown while in prison. His mouth showed white through the beard. His face was snow-white. The great straight-line triangle of the nose stood out monstrously high above the sunken cheeks. The grizzled hair lay in clammy separate wisps back from the high, narrow forehead. On each of the hollow temples was a great bluish-red mark, as though something had pressed on or gripped him there. Slowly, with labour, he opened his great sea-blue eyes, essayed a sort of smile when he recognised the man. His voice sounded a little veiled and like a stranger's. "Sit down, brother-in-law." He moved his head slightly toward the empty bed. Now I have learnt something new since we last met." Olaf Koning bent over Erland and asked if there was anything he needed. There was no answer, doubtless because Erland could not speak, and he took away the cloak from over him. Erland had on him nothing but a pair of linen drawers and a rag of a shirt, and the sight of the swollen and discoloured limbs shook and maddened Simon like some loathsome horror. He wondered whether Erland had a like feeling. A shade of red came over his face as Olaf passed a wet cloth, which he dipped into a vessel of water, down over his arms and legs. And when he laid the cloak over again, Erland pushed it into place with some small movements of his limbs, or by drawing the hood up with his chin till he was quite covered up. "Ah," said Erland. He was a little more like himself in voice now, and the smile on his pale mouth was a little plainer. "Next time it will be worse. But I am not afraid. None need be afraid. They will get nothing out of me this way." Simon felt within himself that the man spoke truth. Torture would not force a word out of Erland Nicolaisen. There was nothing that he might not do, might not reveal in anger or in recklessness. But he would never be moved a hair's breadth by force. And Simon felt that the shame and insult that he himself suffered on another man's behalf, Erland scarcely felt at all. He was filled with an obstinate joy in defying his torturers, and a contented trust in his hardihood. He, who always broke down so pitifully when he came up against a firm will, who might himself doubtless have been cruel in a moment of fear, rose above himself now that in this cruelty he scented an opposer weaker than himself. But Simon's answer, growled through his teeth, was, "Next time? There will be no next time. What do you say, Olaf?" Olaf shook his head, but Erland said, with the shadow of his old reckless flippancy in his voice, "Ah, if I could but believe it as firmly as you! But these men will scarce be content with this." He grew aware of the working of Simon's heavy, sinuous face. "No, Simon, kinsman!" Erland would have raised himself on his elbow. The pain forced from him a strange, muffled groan, and he sank back in a swoon. Olaf and Simon ministered to him clumsily. When the swoon was over, Erland lay a little with open eyes. He spoke then more gravely. "Don't you see? It means a lot for Magnus to get on the track of what men he would better not trust, farther than he can see them. So much unrest and discontent has there been." "Aye, if he thinks that this will quench the discontent," said Olaf Kerning threateningly. Then Erland said in a low and clear voice, "I have dealt so in this matter that few will think it matters how much it goes with me. I know that." The other two men reddened. Simon had thought that Erland didn't see this, and never before had Lady Sunniva been so much as hinted at between them. Now Simon broke out desperately. "How could you have borne yourself so recklessly, so madly?" "I don't understand it either, now," said Erland simply. "But, in hell's name, how did I know she could read? She seemed most unlearned." His eyelids drooped and closed. He was nigh swooning once more. Olaf Kerning muttered about fetching something and went out. Simon bent over Erland, who lay again now with eyes half opened. "Brother-in-law, was Erling Vidkundsen with you in this?" Erland shook his head a little, with a slow smile. "By Jesus, no. We thought either he would not be bold enough to join us, or he wanted all things in his own hands. But don't ask me, Simon. I will say nothing to anybody, just so that I am sure not to let anything slip out." On a sudden, Erland whispered his wife's name. Simon bent over him again. He wondered if the other should ask him to bring Kristin to him now. But Erland said quickly, as if in a flicker of fever, "She must not hear of this, Simon. Say an order has come from the king that no one is to come near me. Take her out to Munin, Skogheim, do you hear? These French or Moorish friends of our king's, they won't give up yet. Get her out of the city before it is noised about. Simon!" Aye, but how he was to bring this about, Simon didn't know. Erland lay a little with his eyes shut. Then he said with a kind of smile, "I thought last night of the time she bore our eldest son. She was in no better case than I, if a man may judge by her crying. And if she has been able to bear it 7 times, for the sake of our joys, I think that I can." Simon was silent. The fearful shrinking he felt from looking into life's deepest secrets of torment and of joy, Erland seemed yet to have no inkling of. He played with the worst and the loveliest things as simply as a guileless boy, whose friends have brought him with them to a bordel, drunken and curious. Erland shook his head impatiently. "These flies are the worst. I think they are the foul fiend himself." Simon took his cap and smote high and low at the thick clusters of blue-black flies, so that they flew up in the air in buzzing, noisy clouds, and trampled furiously into the mud of the floor those that fell stunned. It could not avail much, for the window-hole in the wall stood open. The winter before it had been closed with a wooden shutter with a bladder-covered porthole, but that had made the room too dark. He was still at this when Olaf Koenig came back with a priest bearing a drinking cup. The priest lifted Erland's head and stayed it while he drank. A great deal of the liquor ran out into his beard and down his neck, and he lay quiet and untroubled as a child when the priest afterwards wiped it away with a cloth. Simon felt his whole being in a ferment. The blood thumped and thumped in his neck below the ears, and his heart beat strangely and unsteadily. He stood a moment, gazing back from the doorway at the long body outstretched beneath the cloak. The flush of fever came and went now in waves over Erland's face. He lay with half-open, glittering eyes, but he smiled to his brother-in-law, the shadow of his strangely boyish smile. The next day, as Stig Håkonsson of Mandvik sat at breakfast-board with his guests, Sir Erling Vidkundsen and his son Bjarn, the hoof-beats of a single horse were heard in the courtyard. The next moment the door of the hall was flung open, and Simon Anderson came swiftly towards them. He wiped his face with his sleeve as he came. He was splashed to the neck with mud from his ride. The 3 men rose to meet the newcomer, with little outbursts, half of greeting, half of wonder. Simon didn't answer their greetings. He stood leaning on his sword, both hands upon the hilt, and said, "Would you hear strange tidings? They have taken Erland Nicolausson and stretched him on a rack. Some foreigners the king sent to put him to the question." With a cry the men gathered round Simon Anderson. Stig smote one hand into the other. "What has he said?" At the same moment both he and Bjarn Erlingsson turned, as though unwittingly, towards Sir Erling. Simon burst out into laughter. He laughed and laughed. He sank down on the chair that Bjarn Erlingsson had drawn forward for him, took the ale bowl that the youth proffered him, and drank greedily. "Why are you laughing?" asked Sir Erling sternly. "I laughed at Stig." He sat a little bent forward, with his hands resting on his muddy thighs. Yet once or twice again little bursts of laughter came from him. "I thought, we are sons of nobles here, all of us. I had thought that you would be so wroth that one of our fellows should be so dealt with, that you would have asked first how such things can be. I cannot say that I know very well how the law stands in such matters. Since my lord King Hakon died, it has been enough for me that I owed him that came to his throne my service when he listed to call for it, in peace and in war. Else I have dwelt in quiet upon my estates. But I cannot see anything else than in this case against Erland Nicolausson there have been unlawful doings. His fellows have sifted his case and given judgment in it. With how much right they doomed him to death, I don't know. Then he was offered reprieve and safe conduct, till he could be brought to a meeting with the king, his kinsman. that perchance he might grant Erland grace to make his peace with him. Since then the man has lain in the tower at Acres Castle nigh on a year, and the king has been abroad well nigh all that time. Some letters have passed to and fro, and nothing has come of it. Then he sends hither some varlets. Norsemen they are not, nor of the king's guard, and they dare to put Erland to the question in such a way as none ever heard that a Norseman with a guardsman's rights was dealt with before. And all this while there is peace in the land, and Erland's fellows and his kinsmen are gathering at Tunsberg to honour the king's wedding. What do you think of this, Sir Erling? I think... Erling sat down on the bench over against him. I think that you have set the matter forth clearly and plainly, Simon Dar, as it stands. I don't see that the king can do anything but one of three things now. Either he must let Erland pay the penalty according to the doom given at Nidaros, or he must choose out a new court of guardsmen and have the case against Erland set forth by a man who bears not the knightly name. And they must doom Erland to outlawry with such respite as the law allows for him to remove himself from King Magnus's realm. Or he must grant Erland grace to make his peace with him, and that would be the wisest thing he could do. This matter seems now to me so plain that whomsoever you will lay it before at Tunsberg will join with you and take up your cause. John Haftorson and his brother are there. Erland is their kinsman no less than the king's. And the Ogmundson brothers must see that this is injustice and folly. 'Twere best you went first to the Lord Marshal. Move him and Sir Paul Ericsson to call a meeting of the sworn king's men that are in the town, and that seem fittest to take the matter in hand. Won't you and your kinsman go with me, my lord? We do not intend to go to the wedding feast, said Erling shortly. Simon said, The Haftorsons are young, and Sir Paul is old and ailing, and the others... You know best yourself, my lord. They doubtless have some small power through the king's favour and such like, but, Erling, what are they all beside you? You have such power in this land as no other chief have had since, I know not when. Behind you, sir, are the old houses that folk in this land have known man by man, so far back as record goes of evil times and good in these our countrysides. On the father's side, what is the birth of Magnus Ericsson or Haftor of Suderheim's sons beside yours? Are there riches worth naming besides yours? These counsels you give me, all this will take time, and these Frenchmen are in Oslo, and you may stake your soul they'll not give over. Olaf Koenig has sent letters, and all gentlemen he could find to join with them. The bishop promised he would write, but all this unrest and strife, Erling Vidkundsen, you could end it. In the same hour you stepped forth before King Magnus. You stand foremost among the heirs of those who ruled this land in the old age, and the king knows that you would have us all at your back. I don't know that I saw as much some time back, said Erling bitterly. You speak out warmly for your brother-in-law, Simon, but don't you understand? Now I cannot move. People would say that I came forward the moment they put such duress on Erland that a man might fear he would not be able to keep his tongue between his teeth. There was silence for a while. Then Stig asked again, Has Erland spoken? No, answered Simon impatiently. He has held his tongue, and I think he will go on holding it. Erling, he said beseechingly, he is your kinsman. You were friends. Erling breathed short and heavily once or twice. Yes. Simon Anderson, have you fully understood what Erland Nikolausen had undertaken? To put an end to this sharing of our king with the Swedes, this way of rule that never has been tried before, that seems to bring more and more hardships and troubles on this land with every year that passes, to bring us back to the kingship that we knew of old and that we know brings welfare and good fortune. Don't you see this was a wise and a bold counsel? And don't you see that this counsel can now hardly be taken up by others after him? He has ruined the cause of Nut Porce's sons and other men of the kingly house. There are none for the folk to rally round. You will say, perhaps, that had Erland carried through his intent and brought Prince Haakon to Norway, then had he played into my hands. Much further than the boys' landing had these young boys scarce been able to carry forward their plans without having need of prudent men to come forward and work out what remained to do. So it is. I dare avow it. Yet, God knows, I gained nothing. Rather had I to set aside the care of my own affairs in those 10 years when I lived in disquiet and toil and strife and troubles without end. A few men in this land have understood so much, and with that I must be content. He struck his hand hard against the table. Don't you see, Simon, that the man who took on his shoulders such mighty plans that no one knows whether the welfare of us all in this land and of our children for long ages to come was not the stake in them, and flung it all from him with his breeches on a harlot's bedside? God's blood, he would be well served with the measure that was dealt to Auden Hesterkorn. He went on a little more quietly. Yet would I be fain that Erland should be saved. And believe not that I too am not angered at the tidings you have brought to us. And I think that should you follow my counsel, you will find men and enough to join with you in this matter. But I don't believe that my company would be of such great help to you, that for the sake of it I should do well to come uncalled for before the king. Simon rose stiffly and heavily. His face was streaked and grey with weariness. Stig Håkonsson went over and took him by the shoulders. Now he would have some food brought. He had but bided till they had had their talk out before having serving folk in. But now Simon must strengthen himself with meat and drink, and must sleep on top of it. Simon thanked him. He must ride on in a little while if Stig could lend him a fresh horse. And would he give shelter to his man, John Dork, tonight? Simon had had to leave the man behind on the road, for his horse could not keep up with Simon. Yes, he had ridden most of the night. He had thought for sure that he knew the road out hither well enough, but yet he had gone astray more than once. Stig bade him stay till tomorrow, and he would ride with him himself, at the least a part of the way, and yes, he might as well go on to Tunsberg with him too. Simon said, "There is nothing more for me to stay for here. I would but go over to the church. Seeing that I am here once more, I would yet fain say a prayer where Halfrid lies." The blood rushed and tingled in his weary body. His heart beat deafeningly. It was as though he must drop down headlong. He was as one but half awake. But he heard his own voice say calmly and evenly, "Will you not bear me company, Sir Erling? I know she held you dearest of all her kinsmen." He didn't look at the other, but felt him stiffen. In a little he heard through the rushing and singing of his own blood Erling Vidkunsen's clear and courteous voice. "That will I, willingly, Simon Dar." "It is rough weather," he said, as he buckled on his sword and threw a thick cloak about his shoulders. Simon stood still as stone till the other was ready. Then they went out. Outside the autumn rain poured down, and the mist drove in from the sea so thickly that they could scarce see more than a couple of horses' lengths over the fields and the yellow tree clumps that bordered the path on each side. It was not a long way to the church. Simon fetched the key from the chaplain's house nearby. He was glad when he saw they were new folk, come since his time, since he was spared much small talk. It was a little stone church with a single altar. Unheedingly Simon saw again the same pictures and ornaments he had seen so many 100 times, while he knelt by the white marble tomb a little away from Erling Vidkunsen, saying over his prayers and crossing himself where 'twas fit, without knowing what he did. He didn't understand how he had been able to try this, but now he was in the middle of it. Of what he should say he had no guess, but, sick with horror and shame at himself as he was, he knew that he would make the trial at all costs. He remembered the ageing woman's white, suffering face deep in the half-darkness of the bed, her lovely, gentle voice. That afternoon when he sat on her bedside and she told him. It was a month before the child came, and she herself looked that it should cost her her life, and she was willing and glad to buy their son so dear. Poor little soul that lay here beneath the great stone in a little coffin by his mother's side. No man could do what he had meant to do. But Kristin's white face, she knew what had happened when he came home from a curseness that day. She was pale and calm as she spoke of it and questioned him. But he had seen her eyes in one short glimpse, and he had not dared to meet them afterwards. Where she was now or what she had done, he didn't know. Whether she had stayed in her lodging, or was with her husband, or whether they had prevailed on her to go out to Skogheim. He had left it in Olaf König's and Sira Ingolf's hands. He could do no more, and he thought that he must lose no more time. Simon didn't know that he had hidden his face in his hands. Halfred, there is nothing in it of shame or of sin, my Halfred. And yet, what she had said to him, her husband, of her sorrow and of her love that had made her stay under the old devil's roof. Once already he had killed his child under its mother's heart, and she had stayed on with him because she would not tempt her dearest love. Erling Vidkundsen knelt, his colourless, clear-cut face showing no sign. He held his hands close into his breast, with the palms pressed together. From time to time he crossed himself with a quiet, supple, gracious gesture, then brought his fingertips again together. No, thought Simon. This was so hateful a thing that no man could do it. Not even for Kristin's sake could he do it. They rose together, made obeisance to the altar, and went down the nave. Simon's spurs jingled a little at each step he took on the stone pavement. As yet they had spoken no word together since they had left the manor, and Simon had no idea what would happen now. He locked the church door, and Erling Vidkundsen walked ahead through the graveyard. Under the little roof of the lich gate he stopped. Simon came up. They stood a little in the shelter before going out into the pouring rain. Erling Vidkundsen spoke quietly and evenly, but Simon felt the dull, measureless rage muttering deep within the other. He dared not look up. "What in the devil's name, Simon Anderson, do you mean by devising this?" Simon could not answer a word. "Do you think you can threaten me? Force me to do your will? Because perhaps you have heard some lying rumours of things that happened when you were scarce yet weaned from the breast?" His rage growled nearer the surface now. Simon shook his head. "I thought, my lord, when you called to mind her who was better than the purest gold, perhaps you might take pity on Erlend's wife and children." Sir Erling looked at him. He made no answer, but began stripping moss and lichen from the stones of the churchyard wall. Simon swallowed and wet his lips with his tongue. "I scarce know what I thought, Erling Vidkundsen. Maybe that when you remembered her that suffered all those evil years, without other comfort or help than God alone, that then you would help these many unhappy beings, because you can, since you could not help her. If you have repented at any time that you rode away from Mandmick the other day and let Halfred remain behind in Sir Finn's power?" "But I have not," Erlen's voice was piercing now, "because I know that she never did. But this I think you could never understand. For had you ever understood for 1 hour how proud she was, the lady you won to wife," he laughed in his wrath, "then you would not have done this. I don't know how much you know, but you may as well know this. They sent me, for Hakon lay sick then, to fetch her home to her kindred. Elin and she had grown up together as sisters. They were much the same age, though Elin was her father's sister. Things had come about so that, had she come home from Mandwick, we had been forced to meet daily and hourly. We sat and talked the whole night through in the balcony of the Dragon House. Every word that was spoken both she and I can answer for to God on the day of doom. And then let him answer us why things happen that way. Though, indeed, God rewarded her holiness in the end, gave her a good husband to comfort her for the one she had had before, a whelp of a boy like you, who lay with her serving women in her own house and had her bring up your bastards." He flung away the ball of moss he had kneaded together. Simon stood motionless and dumb. Erling peeled off another flake of moss and flung it away. "I did what she bade me to do. Have you heard enough? There was no other way. Wherever else in the world we might have met, we had. Adultery is no fair word. Incest is yet uglier." Simon moved his head in a stiff little nod. He felt it himself. It would be laughable to say what he thought. Erling Vidkundsen had been a man in his 20s, courtly and gallant. Halfred had loved him so that she would fain have kissed his footprints in the dewy grass of the courtyard that morning in spring. He was an ageing, hulking, ugly farmer. And Kristin? Never for sure would the thought come in her head that there could be peril to the soul of either, should they live under one roof for 20 years. Surely he had learnt to understand that well enough. So he said in a low voice, almost humbly, "She didn't have the heart to suffer the innocent child, even though it was her woman's child by her husband, to fare ill in the world. It was she that prayed me to do it right and justice, so far as lay in my power. Oh, Erling, for Erlen's poor innocent wife's sake, she will grieve to death. Perhaps I thought I could not leave any stone unturned in seeking help for her and all her children." Erling Vidkundsen stood leaning against the gatepost. His face was calm, as it was wont to be, and his voice cool and courteous when he spoke again. "I liked her well, Kristin Lavransdatter, the little I have seen of her. A fair and stately woman she is. And I have told you already, Simon Anderson, I think full surely that you will find help if you will follow my counsel. But I don't understand rightly what you meant by this little charade. You surely cannot think that because I had to suffer my father's brother to rule the matter of my wedding, being then in my nonage, and because the maid I liked best was betrothed elsewhere when we first met, and as innocent as you say, I think Erlen's wife is not either. Aye, you are wedded to her sister, I know that. But it is you, and not I, that has brought about this strange parley, and so you must suffer that I name it. I remember there was talk enough about it, the time Erland was wedded with her. It was against Lavrans Bjorgulfsson's counsel and his will that bargain came about. But the maid had thought more of having her own will than of obeying her father or guarding her honour. Yes, she may be a good wife none the less, but she had won Erland after all, and they have doubtless had their share of joy and mirth. I don't think that Lavrans had much joy of that son-in-law. He had chosen another man for his daughter ere she came to know Erland. She was promised in a marriage. I know this. He stopped short, looked at Simon a moment, and turned his head aside in some confusion. Flushing red with shame, Simon bent his head on his breast, but he spoke none the less low but firmly. Yes, she was promised to me. For a moment they stood, not venturing to look at each other. Then Erling Vidkundsen threw away the last ball of moss he had gathered, turned and went out into the rain. Simon was left standing alone, but when the other was some way off in the mist, he stopped and beckoned impatiently. Then they went back together as silently as they had come. When they came close to the manor, Sir Erling said, "I will do it, Simon Anderson. You must wait until tomorrow, then we can ride in company, all four together." Simon looked up at the other, with a face all drawn with pain and shame. He would have given thanks, but could not. He had to bite his lip hard, his lower jaw trembled so violently. As they were passing through the door of the hall, Erling Vidkundsen touched Simon's shoulder, as it were by chance, but each knew that neither of them dared look at the other. The next day, when they were making ready for the journey, Stig Håkonsson pressed Simon to let him lend him some clothes. Simon had brought no change of garments with him. Simon looked down at himself. His man had brushed and cleaned up his dress, but it had suffered past remedy in his long ride through foul weather. But he slapped himself on the thighs. "I am too fat, Stig, and I am not going there to be a guest at the feasting." Erling Vidkundsen stood with one foot on the bench, while his son buckled the gilded spur on it. It seemed as though Sir Erling tried to keep his serving folk at a distance today, as much as might be. The knight laughed in an oddly vexed fashion. "Won't do any harm, I think, if it should show on Simon Dar that he has not spared himself in his kinsman's service, but bursts right in from the high road with his bold and subtle speech. He is no tongue-tied loon, this one-time kinsman of ours, Stig. One thing only I fear, that he may not know himself when he should stop." Simon stood there, flushing darkly, but he said no word. In all that Erling Vidkundsen had said to him since the day before, he marked a grudging mockery and a strange, unwilling kindness, and a firm will to see this matter through, since once and for all he had taken it up. So they rode with him north from Manvik, Sir Erling, his son, and Stig, with in all 10 fairly clad and well-armed yeomen. Simon, with his single follower, thought now he could have chosen to come to the meeting more fittingly attended and equipped. Simon Dar of Formo had no need to ride with his former kinsman in the guise of a small franklin that had sought their aid in his helplessness. But he heeded not much. He was so weary and so broken with what he had gone through the day before that almost it seemed to him now he didn't care what the outcome of this journey might be. Simon had ever believed that he put no faith in the ugly rumours about King Magnus. He was no such saint but that he could suffer a gross jest amongst grown-up menfolk. But when people stuck their heads together and muttered shudderingly of dark and secret sins, he grew ever ill at ease. and it seemed to him unseemly to believe or to hearken to anything of the kind about the king, among whose sworn men he was counted. Yet he was filled with wonder when he stood before the young king. He had not seen Magnus Eriksson since the king was a child, and in spite of his disbelief he had looked to find something womanish, soft or unhealthy about him. But this was one of the most handsome young men Simon had set eyes on, and he looked manly and kingly too, despite his youth and slender fineness. He wore a flowing robe of light blue shot with green, falling to his feet, and tied about his slim waist with a gilded belt, and he bore his tall, lean body with exceeding grace in the heavy dress. King Magnus had light hair, which lay smoothly on his well-formed head, but was cunningly curled at the ends, so that it seemed to toss and wave about his neck's broad, free-standing pillar. His features were fine and boldly cut, the hue of his skin fresh, with red cheeks and a yellowish tinge of sunburn. He had clear eyes and an open look. He bore him fairly and with winning gentleness as he greeted his liegemen. Then in a while he laid his hand on Erling Vidkunsten's sleeve and drew him some steps apart from the others, while he thanked him for his coming. They talked together a while, and Erling let fall that there was a special matter wherein he had to crave the king's grace and bounty. The royal ushers then set a chair for the knight in front of the king's high seat, showed the other 3 men to places somewhat further down the hall, and then went out. Without effort, Simon seemed to have found again the mannerly and courtly bearing he had learned in his youth, and since he had yielded and taken from Stig the loan of a long brown dress of state, in outward looks too he differed in no way from the other men. But as he sat there he felt as though he were in the midst of a dream. He was, and he wasn't, the same as young Simon Dar, the quick-witted and courteous son of a noble knight, who had borne napkin and taper before King Hakon in Oslo Palace an endless tale of winters ago. He was, and he was not, Simon the Esquire of Formoe, who had lived a life of freedom and cheer away north in the Dale through all these years, free from care after a fashion, though he had known all his days that within him lay this glowing ember. But he turned his thoughts away from it. A dull and threatening humour of revolt rose up in the man. It was no willed sin or fault of his that he knew of, but fate that had blown the embers into a blaze, so that he must strive and make no sign while roasting over a slow fire. He stood up when all the others did so. King Magnus had risen. "Dear kinsman," came his fresh young voice, "I think the matter stands thus. The prince is my brother, but we have never tried to keep court together with a common guard. The same men cannot serve us both. Nor does it seem that Erland had meant that things should continue in this way, even though for a time he did hold his wardenship under my hand, while at the same time he was Hakon's sworn man. But those of my men who would rather follow my brother Hakon shall have leave from my service and freedom to seek their fortune in his house. Who they may be, I meant to learn from Erland's mouth. Then you must, Sir King, try if you can to come to agreement with Erland Nicolason in this matter. You must keep the promise of safe conduct that you have given, and grant your kinsman an audience." "Yes, he is my kinsman, and your kinsman, and Sir Ivar did move me to promise him safe conduct. But he didn't keep his oath to me, and he didn't remember the kinship between us." King Magnus laughed a little and again laid his hand on Erling's arm. "My kinsmen seem to be faithful to the byword we have in this land, none so unkind as kin. Now is it my full will to show my kinsman Erland of Huseby grace for the sake of God and Mary Virgin, and for my own lady's sake. He can have his life and his goods, and he can remain in Norway, if he will make his peace with me. Or I will let him leave my lands, if he will go to his new master, Prince Haakon. The same grace will I grant to every man who has been leagued with him. But I will know who they are, and which of my men dwelling up and down this land of ours has been a false servant to his lord. What do you say, Simon Anderson? I know that your father was my grandfather's trusty henchman. You yourself served King Haakon with honour. Do you think that I don't have the right to make inquiry in this matter? I think, my lord king. Simon stepped forward and again made obeisance. That so long as your grace rules according to this land's law and custom mercifully, you will surely never learn who the men may be that had planned to have recourse to lawlessness and reason. For as soon as the people of this land see that your grace will hold fast to the right and justice that your forefathers have set up, to be sure no man in this realm will think of troubling the peace. And those who thought it seemed hard to believe that you, my lord, young as you are, could rule 2 kingdoms with wisdom and strength, they will remain silent. It is so, my lord king, put in Erling Vidkundsen. No man in this land has thought of denying you obedience in anything you may rightfully command. Have they not? Then you think perhaps that Erland has not been guilty of disloyalty and treason, when we look more closely into the case? For a moment Sir Erling seemed at fault for an answer, and Simon took the word. You, sir, are our lord. To you each man looks to punish law-breaking by the law. But if you should follow where Erland Nikolausen has led the way, it might well befall that the men whose names you now so hotly seek to know should come forth and name them aloud, or other men who may begin to ponder over the rights and wrongs of this matter. For much talk there will come of it, if your grace should deal as you have threatened, with a man so well known and so high-born as Erland Nikolausen. What do you mean, Simon Anderson? Said the king sharply. He grew red as he spoke. Simon means, Bjarne Erlingsson broke in, that it might do your grace an ill service, if folk should begin to ask why Erland must suffer such dishonour as the law warrants all men against, save thieves and villains. They might come then to think on King Haakon's other grandsons. Erling Vidkundsen turned sharply on his son. He looked angry, but the king only asked dryly, Don't you count traitors and rebels as villains? No one calls them that, sir, if their plans go well, answered Bjarne. For a moment they all stood silent. Then Erling Vidkundsen spoke. Whatever Erland should be called, my lord, it's not just that you should override the law to come at him. Then should the law be mended in this matter, said the king vehemently. If so it is that I have no power to get me by any means the knowledge of how folk mean to keep faith with me, yet you cannot act upon amended law before it is changed, said Sir Erling doggedly, without oppressing the folk of the land. And folk in Norway have ever found it hard to get used to oppression from its kings. Ha! I have my knighthood and my sworn king's men to back me, answered Magnus Eiríksson with a boyish laugh. What do you say to that, Simon? I say, my lord, it might well prove that there is no such sure backing. To judge by the measure the knighthood and the nobles of Denmark and Sweden have dealt their kings, when the commons had no strength to back up the kingly power against them. But if your grace be set on such counsels, then I would pray that you loose me from your service, for then I would rather be found among the common folk. Simon had spoken so calmly and soberly that it seemed as though the king at first did not understand his meaning. Then he laughed. Is that a threat, Simon Anderson? Is it so that you would throw down your glove to me? "That must be as you will, my lord," said Simon as evenly as before. But he took his gloves out of his belt and held them in his hand. Then young Bjarne bent forward and took them. "These are not seemly wedding gloves for your grace to buy." He held the thick, worn riding gloves in the air and laughed. "If it should come out, sir, that you are seeking for such gloves, you might well have proffered you all too many of them, and all too cheap." Erling Vidkundsen uttered a cry. With a sharp movement he seemed to sweep the young king to one side, and the three men to another. And he drove the men down the hall toward the door. "I must speak with the king alone." "No, I would speak with Bjarne," cried the king, running after. But Sir Erling pushed his son out with the others. They loitered about a while in the castle yard and on the hill outside. None of them spoke a word. Stig Håkonsson looked doubtfully, but held his tongue as he had done throughout. Bjarne Erlingsson went about all the time with a little hidden smile. In a while Sir Erling's weapon-bearer came, and prayed them to wait for Erling at their lodging. Their horses were in the castle yard. Afterward they sat in the inn. They were shy of speech about what had just happened. At last they fell into talk of their horses and hounds and hawks. The end of it was that Stig and Simon sat far on to the evening telling stories about women. Stig Håkonsson had always had great store of such tales, but with Simon the worst was that most of those he called to mind Stig straightway began to tell, and it was ever so that either the thing had happened to himself, or it had happened of late at some place near Manvik, even if Simon remembered having heard the tale in his boyhood from the housecarls at home at Differen. But he chuckled and laughed as heartily as Stig. From time to time it was as though the bench rocked beneath him as he sat there. He was afraid of something, but dared not think what it was. Bjarne Erlingsson laughed quietly, drank wine and munched apples, fiddled with the hood of his cape, and told now and then a little snatch of a tale. They were the worst of all, but they were so cunningly veiled that Stig did not understand them. Bjarne had heard them from a priest in Bjorgvin, he said. At last Erling came. His son went to meet him and take from him his outer garments. Erling turned angrily on the youth. "You!" He flung his cloak into Bjarne's hand, and there flitted across his face, as though against his will, the shadow of a smile. "Right. Now you must be content, Simon Andresen. I think that you may safely hope the day is not far off when you shall sit in peace and comfort together on your neighbouring manors, you and Erland, and his wife and all their sons." Simon had grown a shade paler when he stood up and thanked Sir Erling. He knew now what the fear was that he had not dared to look in the face. But now there was no way out. About 14 days later, Erland Nicolausson was set free. Simon, with his 2 men, and Ulf Haldarsson, rode out to Akersness and fetched him. The trees were almost bare already, for it had blown hard the week before. A black frost had set in now. The earth rang hard under the horses' hoofs, and the fields were wan with rime as they rode in towards the town. It looked as though snow were coming. The heavens were evenly overspread with cloud, and the daylight was sullen and chilly grey. Simon had seen that Erland dragged one foot a little as he came out into the castle yard, and he seemed somewhat stiff and unsure in mounting. He was very pale too. He had had his beard taken off and his hair cut and made trim. His upper face was now a dull yellow, and below, the blue of his shaven beard showed against white cheeks and chin. There were hollows beneath his eyes, but he made a stately figure in his long dark blue robe and cloak, and as he said farewell to Olaf Koenig, and made gifts of money to the men who had guarded him and brought him food in prison, he bore himself like a chieftain, parting from the housefolk at a wedding feast. At first, as they rode, he seemed to feel cold. He shivered more than once. Then a little colour came into his cheeks. His face lighted up. It was as though sap and life were welling up in him. Simon thought, sure it was, Erland was no easier to break than a willow wand. They came to the lodging, and Kristin went to meet her husband in the courtyard. Simon tried not to look, but he could not resist. They gave each other their hands and exchanged some words in quiet, clear tones. They managed this meeting in the sight of all the people of the house, fair and modestly enough. Only that both flushed red, looked at each other for a second, and then both dropped their eyes. Then Erland proffered his hand again to his wife, and they went together towards the loft room, where they were to dwell whilst they were in the city. Simon turned towards the room where he and Kristin had lived till now. Then Kristin turned at the lowest step of the stairway and called to him in a wonderful ringing voice. "Will you not come, brother-in-law? Get some food first, and you, Ulf, you come too." She seemed so young and supple as she stood there, turned a little from the hips and looked back over her shoulder. As soon as she came to Oslo, she had begun to fasten her headgear in another fashion. Here in the south it was only small farmers' wives who wore the linen headdress in the old world way she had done ever since she was wedded, tight around the face like a nun's coif, with the falls fastened crosswise over the shoulders, so that the neck was quite hidden, and with many folds on the sides and over the knot of hair at the back of the head. In Trondheim it was accounted, so to speak, a token of piety to set up the coif in this fashion, which Archbishop Eilif praised always as the most fitting and modest way for wedded women. But so as to be not too obvious, she had taken up now with the fashion of these southern parts. The linen cloth lay smoothly over the crown of the head and hanging straight down behind, so that the front hair showed and the neck and shoulders were free. And then it was the proper thing that the plaits should be but tied up, so that they did not show under the edge of the coif, while the linen fitted close above, throwing out the form of the head. True, Simon had seen this before, and he thought that it became her well. Yet he had not seen before how young it made her look, and her eyes shone like stars. Farther on in the day many folk appeared to greet Erland. Ketil of Skog, Marcus Torgersen, and later in the evening Olaf Koning himself, Sira Ingolf, and Canon Guttorm, a priest of St. Halvard's church. When the two priests came, it had begun to snow, a slight, dry, fine-grained drizzle, and they had missed the path and come in among some burdocks. Their clothes were full of the burrs. Everyone set to work to pluck burrs off the priests and their followers. Erland and Kristin rid Canon Guttorm of his, and from time to time their faces flushed, and their voices were strangely unsteady as they jested with the priest and laughed. Simon drank much in the first part of the evening, but he grew not at all light-headed with the drink, only a little heavy in the body. He heard each word that was said with unnatural sharpness. The others soon grew free-spoken. None of them were friends to the king. Simon was heartily sick of it all now it was over. Foolish prate it was that they babbled forth as they sat there, loud-voiced and heated. Ketil Asmundsson was somewhat simple, and his brother-in-law Marcus was none too wise either. Olaf Koning was a right-minded and sensible man, but short-sighted. Neither did the two priests seem to Simon too clear-witted. They all sat there and listened to Erland and chimed in with him, and he grew more and more like himself as he had ever been, wild and reckless. He had taken Kristin's hand now and laid it over his knee and sat playing with her fingers. They sat so that their shoulders touched. Now the deep flush showed clear through her skin. She could not take her eyes from him. When he stole an arm about her waist, her mouth trembled, so that she had much ado keeping her lips shut. Then the door opened and Munin Bardson stepped in. "Ah, last came the great bull himself," shouted Erland, laughing, and leapt up to meet him. "Help us, God and Mary Virgin! I believe you care not a straw, Erland," said Munin in vexation. "Aye, do you think then it would help to whimper and sorrow now, kinsman? Never have I seen the like of you. All your welfare you have cast away." "Aye, for I was never the kind to go unbreeched to hell, to save my breeches from the burning," said Erland, and Kristin laughed softly and dizzily. Simon lay down over the table, his head between his arms. If only they might think he was so drunk already that he had fallen asleep. He would much prefer to be left in peace. Nothing was otherwise than he had looked that it would be, should have looked it would be, at the least. Nothing, not even her. Here she sat, the only woman amongst all these men, as gentle and bashful and fearless and secure as ever. Even so had she been yonder other time, when she betrayed him, shameless or innocent, he didn't know which. Oh, no, 'twas not so either. She had not been so secure. She had not been shameless. Behind the calmness of her bearing, she had not been calm. But that man had bewitched her. For Erland's sake she would gladly tread over red-hot stones. And she had trodden over him as though she didn't know he was anything but a cold stone. Ah, all this was folly. Her mind was set on having her own way, and she heeded nothing else. Let them have their joyance. He need not care a jot. What did it matter to him if they had 7 sons more, so that there would be 14 to part betwixt them the half of Lavransdatter estate? It didn't look as though he would need to be careful and troubled for his children. Ramborg was not so quick at bearing children as her sister. As though in due time he would leave behind his children and children's children in riches and power. But it was all one to him, tonight. He would rather have drunk more, but he knew that tonight God's gifts would not cheer him. And then he would have had to raise his head and perhaps join in the talk. "Ah, you think, I guess, that you were the man for regent of the realm," said Munin scornfully. "No, surely you must know we had meant that place for you," laughed Erland. "In God's name, heed your tongue, man," the others laughed. Erland came over and touched Simon's shoulder. "Are you asleep, brother-in-law?" Simon looked up. The other stood before him with a goblet in his hand. "Come, drink with me, Simon. You I have to thank most of all that I came off with my life, and such as it is, 'tis dear to me, lad. You stood by me like a brother. Had you not been my brother-in-law, I think I had lost my head for sure, and then you could have wed my widow." Simon sprang up. A moment the two stood looking at each other. Erland grew white and sobered, his lips parted in a gasp. With his clenched fist, Simon struck the goblet out of the other's hand. The mead splashed on the floor. Then he turned and went out of the room. Erland stood there alone. Without knowing what he did, he dried his hand and wrist with the skirt of his coat, then looked behind him. The others had seen nothing. With his foot he thrust the goblet in under the bench. He stood still a moment, then went quietly out after his brother-in-law. Simon Dar stood at the foot of the stairway. John Dalk was leading his horses out of the stable. Simon made no movement when Erland came down to him. "Simon! Simon! I didn't know what I was saying." "You know it now." Simon's voice was toneless. He stood quite still, not looking at the other. Erland looked about him, as at his wits' end. The moon showed dimly a pale patch through the veil of cloud. Small, hard grains of snow showered down upon them. Erland made a shivering motion. "Where are you going?" he asked dully, looking at the man and the horses. "To find me another place to sleep," said Simon shortly. "Perhaps you can understand that here I care not to be." "Simon!" Erland burst out. "I don't know what I would give to unsay what I just said." "Neither do I," answered the other as before. The door of the upper room opened. Kristin came out on the balcony with a lantern in her hand. She bent over the railing and threw the light down on them. "Why are you standing there?" she asked in a clear voice. "What are you doing outside?" I felt I must go out and see to my horses. It's the courtly fashion to say," answered Simon, laughing up to her. "But you have taken your horses out," she said in laughing wonder. "Yes, a man will do strange things in his cups," said Simon in the same tone. "Well, come back now," she broke in brightly and gladly. "All right, in a moment." She went in and Simon called out to John to take back the horses. He turned towards Erland. The man was standing there, strangely helpless in looks and bearing. "I shall come in a little. We must try to bear through as though this were unspoken, Erland, for our wife's sake. But so much perhaps you can understand. You were the last man on earth that I would have know of this. And remember, I am not so forgetful as you." The door above was opened again. The guests came out in a troop. Kristin was with them, and her woman bearing the lantern. "Aye," tittered Munin Bardson, "the night is well worn already, and these two good folks would rather go to bed, I think." "Erland, Erland, Erland." Kristin had thrown herself into his arms the moment they stood alone within the loft-room door. She clung close and tightly to him. "Erland, you look so sorrowful." She whispered in fear, with her half-open lips close to his mouth. "Erland." She pressed the palms of her hands to his temples. He stood a little with his arms laid loosely around her. Then, with a soft moaning sound in his throat, he crushed her to him. Simon went across to the stable. He would have said something to John, but he forgot it on the way. For a while he stood in the stable door, looking up at the light haze of the moon and the tumbling snow. It had begun now to fall in great flakes. John and Ulf came out and shut the door behind them, and the three men went together across to the house where they were to sleep.